Okay. All right, we're moving on to level 3 and chapter 3. So you've read the play, you're starting to figure out the sort of mindset that they're asking you to use for this. And this part is called gathering information. There are a few things that I want to talk about before I talk about the chapter itself. And that is what it means to have a narrator and an unreliable narrator. I want to talk about Stanislavski, and I want to talk about genre, another fancy French word. So in Glass Menagerie, we have a narrator, right? We have Tom. He talks directly to us, much like I'm doing with you now. Now, sometimes a play will have a narrator. If it's a well-written play, it's going to be for a reason, just like they're discussing in these questions. We can't just take it for granted when we're doing play analysis. Now, in most of the movies and TV shows you watch, there is a fourth wall, just like there is in many plays. So if I were not doing a narration video where I'm talking directly to the camera, and I imagine to you, my lovely students, then I would be talking to someone over here, to my scene partner. You would see the side of my face. I would pretend that this camera is not here, just like how if I were doing this live on stage, I would pretend the audience wasn't there. But of course, actors know that the camera's there. Actors know the audience is there because they have to sort of cheat to them. They have to make themselves visible. There are certain techniques that actors learn to be able to tell the story most clearly for the camera or for the audience. So we have 3 walls. I have a wall behind me and I have 2 walls on either side, but the invisible wall between me and a camera, when I'm talking to someone off camera, we call that a fourth wall. And it's the same thing in an audience. We call that a fourth wall. It's an invisible wall. And in realism, which is what A Raisin in the Sun is, the play that you're going to be reading and evaluating for your final, they keep the fourth wall the whole time. There are 3 walls because they're in an apartment. And it's sort of called a kitchen sink drama because it's all about realism. It's about people who really live in a real apartment. Things happen that actually could happen in real life, right? No one flies. There's no like special genies or fairies or time travel or anything like that. That is classic realism. But with Glass Menagerie, there are 2 different time periods, right? There's one in which our narrator is talking to us directly about these events we see in the play that happened in his past. And then there is that time period in the past where there is a fourth wall and the characters interact with each other and don't seem to recognize that we, the audience, are there. So note that when you see a piece or read a play that has a narrator, ask what they're for. I directed an interesting play last year called The Other Place, and there was an unreliable narrator. And this is a thing that comes up sometimes in plays and movies and stuff like that. When there's a narrator, we tend to trust this person. We think, oh, everything they're saying is true. We're seeing the story from their point of view. That was an example of a play in which we realized our narrator was not reliable. She was telling us her point of view, but the play was about a physician and she was getting early Alzheimer's. So the stuff that she was saying directly to us, a lot of it actually wound up not being true. And that was part of the interesting structure of the play. And it helped us, the audience, realize what it must feel like to have Alzheimer's, right? You don't know what information to trust and what's real and what isn't, right? So structurally, that was there for a really important reason. What about Glass Menagerie? And what about any other play you ever read that has a narrator breaking the fourth wall, doing direct address or directing their speech directly to the audience? Okay, so they mentioned Stanislavski in this a little bit, and I just have to talk about him a little because I don't want you to get out of a class like this and not know who he is. Konstantin Stanislavski was a Russian guy, as you might guess from his last name, and he lived in Russia like 130 years ago, around the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s, and he's known as the father of acting training. He kind of was the first person to invent a system to train actors so they could be reliably good instead of have to just rely on like if they were having a good night or an off night. And that's just what acting training is for, as those of you who are in our program here know, to give you a reliable system. Now, he was also a director of plays, he was also a theorist, and a lot of the concepts and the terms that he came up with, like given circumstances, beats, things like that, we still use today. So he's a really important guy in theater history. If you're a theater major and you take theater history, he'll come up in that too, but now you have a little sneak preview. Oh, and then the other word I wanted to talk about before we get into the chapter is genre. You say it, genre. Awesome, another fancy French word like denouement, and it basically means category, the kind of show it is. I mentioned in a previous video that I'm not terribly fond of the sports story genre just because I'm not very sportsy. I don't know any of the rules. I'm not that interested in it. But if it's well written and well produced, then I'll watch it. I like in film, I like indie films, which is kind of its own genre, right? With its own like music and camera styles and stuff like that. And on stage, I'm not fond of things that are flat out musical comedy. I like musicals that have a little bit of bite to them, like Sondheim musicals and like Dear Evan Hansen that has, you know, some light and some dark and stuff like that. Some people love farce, which is a kind of a subcategory of the genre comedy, and people call farce comedy on steroids. I recently directed a farce and it had a lot of swearing, a lot of people falling down, a lot of physical comedy, a lot of absurd things happening, people running in and out of doors. So genre is a fancy French word for a category of theater. And it is worth, as you're going through your education and developing your sort of adult view on the world and your own mindset, it's worth asking, what are your preferred genres? Which do you like? Which do you dislike? And how can you be open to new ones? Because what you like now, excuse me, I'm itchy, might be different from what you like in the future. Okay, great. Let's talk about the chapter. All right, we talked about Stanislavski. Great, I'm on page 38. They talk about the given circumstances, and they say to some degree analysis of given circumstances demands that we interpret the playwright's intent. This, I think, is one of the coolest things about studying plays. It's a way that we can time travel, because we have to understand the point of view the playwright was using to write this play, because otherwise we don't really understand what their intent was. Now, we don't have to honor their intent because you may be doing Hamlet and that was set in a previous era in a different country. And now we're living in the United States in 2025 and we have a different view of the world, right? But before you do your personal interpretation of a play, you've got to do the historical research to find out what William Shakespeare's world was like in England back in whenever the heck he wrote Hamlet, 1603 or whatever. For Glass Menagerie, what does that mean? What were the lenses through which Tennessee William looked at the world? They talk about historical, geographic, social, cultural circumstances. And one of the cool things about studying this play is that it takes place in St. Louis, which is just over there. Okay. You don't have to do all of that work yourself, although we do have this thing called the internet. So it's easy to do research now. But of course, you want to, as I think we'd mentioned before, not necessarily trust everything that's on the internet. You want to know how to find the good stuff. And if you're not sure, you can ask a reference librarian because they are just waiting for you to come and ask them questions exactly like that. They want to help you. Okay. So pay attention on page 39 to the words exposition or backstory. And by the time you watch this video, you've probably already turned in your backstory video about your exposition and who you are. Now, one of the ways you can tell whether or not a play is good is by looking at the exposition. Some of you probably have siblings. I do too. Something I almost never say to my siblings is, well, since you're my sister, you have to blah, 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 right? Like, I don't think I've ever articulated to my sister that she's my sister because we both know that. So if there's exposition and someone rather clunkily has a line like that, it might not be the best written play. But if it's a skillful playwright who has one character say to their sister, you have to do this for me if you want to be mom's favorite daughter, that is a good way to work in some expositional information in a way that also can increase your understanding of relationship. Maybe these two sisters have a little bit of a rivalry for the mother's affection or something like that. Okay, so exposition or backstory, make sure you know what that is, and they give you a lot of information about how to identify it. And then we're gonna talk about place. And as I mentioned, Glass Menagerie takes place in St. Louis, but the character of Amanda, the mother, is obviously not originally from St. Louis. She's from the South. She's from the Deep South. She's from a different economic strata. I know that's not geographical, but still, that has a lot to do with this play. I live in Missouri now. It is the 9th state I've lived in, and all of those states have been so different from each other. So think about geography and how that affects things. And if you have an opportunity to travel, please do it because it helps you understand why setting is really, really important in plays. Also, little dig to Kansas City on page 40. Hey. Okay. Great. And then on page 41, they mention attitudes regarding ethnicity. And this is really interesting. Sometimes people want to like cancel a play or not do it because there are things in it that are offensive to us now because we've made a lot of progress in general with honoring that equality is a good thing to have and that the American dream is supposed to be for everyone. But there is a kind of racist reference early on in the play, although the character isn't intending to be racist, right? It's just sort of like subconscious racism. The same thing comes up when the character of Amanda is talking to Tom about the name of his gentleman caller friend who he's bringing over. And she realizes that he's Irish and she's making certain decisions about what he's like based on stereotypes of Irish people. They were a relatively recent immigrant group to come to America, and there were certain stereotypes about them, just like there are about a lot of immigrant groups. Also, there's a little reference in the play to the lights over Garfinkel's delicatessen. I, as a person who's Jewish, know that that's a Jewish name and that a lot of Jews ran delis. And so the fact that they had to live in a neighborhood that was mixed and that had Jews in it meant that they weren't living in a fancy neighborhood. So anyway, look for stuff like that when you read plays. On page 42 is a heading called Attitudes Regarding Marriage, Family, and the Sexes. Those will be stated. Read carefully, this is a quote, and do not apply your own values and attitudes to the text. So you may read a play called Angels in America, and you may have learned about the Latter-day Saints religion. You may think like it's really weird, but there's a couple of Mormon characters in that. Don't put that idea you have about how the religion might be weird onto those characters. It's our duty to remain as open-minded as possible so that we can read the play for what it really is, for what the author intended, without any subjective lens that we wear clouding our reading of the play. Okay. There is a heading called language use. I have been told by a student that I am into linguistic determinism, which is a very interesting term, and it means that the way we speak is who we are. So I want you to pay careful attention to that section about language use. We need to be skillful observers and interpreters of characters' speech. Different people say things in different ways, like we talked about when we were talking about Aristotle's 6 elements, and characters create plot depending on who they are. They create their world depending on what they say and what they do, and how they, and how they say what they say. They talk about regional accents a little bit. That was kind of interesting to me. And Southern accents. Oh yeah. And then bottom of 43, plays in fantastical settings. I got to direct a play called Eurydice in the fall semester of the last academic season. And that was a fantastical setting. It was not realism. It was a world that the playwright made up. Kitty cat, what are you doing back there? That doesn't really exist. And then she set part of the play in the underworld. As far as I know, none of us listening to this right now have ever visited the underworld, so it was a fantastical setting. So think about that and about how even those fantastical settings have given circumstances, and we need to be consistent about those given circumstances, even if the given circumstances or the world of the play, the conventions or the contract, is that the conventions change, right? But we want to be really deliberate about that in our readings and in our stagings. Okay. And then we're getting to your questions for this chapter. So thanks very much, and be sure to read carefully and email me with any questions.